Garrett Pritchard woke at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of silence, the wrong kind of silence. After 36 years of ranching in the shadow of Montana's crazy mountains, he'd learned to read the morning sounds like a language. The lowing of cattle stirring in the dawn cold, the creak of barnwood settling, the shuffle and snort of Ajax, his 18-year-old Hereford bull moving in his stall. But this morning, there was nothing. Garrett sat up in bed, his weather-worn hand reaching instinctively for the shirt draped over the chair. His wife, Colleen, stirred beside him. "What's wrong?" "Ajax," was all he said. She was awake immediately. Colleen had grown up on a ranch herself. She understood that one word carried the weight of concern, of intuition, born from decades of knowing every animal's routine like clockwork. Garrett pulled on his boots without bothering to lace them and grabbed his heavy work coat from the hook by the door. The October air hit him like a cold slap as he stepped off the porch, his breath forming white clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Frost glittered on the fence posts, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl cut through the stillness. The barn loomed ahead, a massive structure his grandfather had built in 1947 with timber from their own land. Garrett had been born in the house just beyond it, had taken his first steps in this very dirt, had learned to ride holding onto his father's belt while sitting on Ajax's broad back when the bull was just a calf. Ajax wasn't just livestock, he was family. He was history. Garrett pushed open the barn door, and his heart sank. The stall that had housed Ajax for the past 5 years, ever since the old bull had officially retired from breeding duties, stood empty. The gate hung open, swinging slightly in the draft. Fresh straw lay undisturbed. The water trough was full. Ajax was gone. No, Garrett muttered, his pulse quickening. He checked the other stalls, calling out, Ajax, you stubborn old cuss, where are you?" Nothing. Garrett's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Ajax was 18, ancient for a bull. His hips had arthritis. His eyesight was failing. He moved slowly, deliberately, and hadn't wandered beyond his stall in years. For him to be gone meant something was very wrong. Had he collapsed somewhere? Had predators gotten to him despite his size? Had he somehow sensed his time was ending and wandered off to die alone, the way old animals sometimes did? That last thought made Garrett's chest tighten painfully. He ran back to the house, bursting through the door. "Colleen, call Wyatt. Ajax is gone." Wyatt was their son, 28 years old, who ran the cattle operation now while Garrett had transitioned into a more advisory role. Within 10 minutes, Wyatt's truck was pulling into the yard, headlights cutting through the darkness. "How long has he been gone?" Wyatt asked, jumping out before the engine even stopped. "I don't know. Sometime after evening feed. I checked on him at 7 and he was fine." "That's almost 10 hours, Dad. He could be anywhere." Garrett knew his son was right, but he refused to accept it. "He can't have gone far. His hips barely let him move from stall to pasture. We'll find him." They saddled 2 horses, Garrett's mare, Stella, and Wyatt's gelding, Copper, and set out as the sun began its slow climb over the mountains. The ranch covered 1,200 acres of rolling grassland, pine forests, and rocky outcroppings. It was beautiful country, but it was also dangerous country for an elderly, half-blind bull. They searched the near pastures first, calling Ajax's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked the creek where the cattle usually watered, the salt lick stations, the windbreaks where animals sheltered during storms. Nothing. By noon, they'd covered half the ranch. Garrett's worry had transformed into something deeper, a gnawing fear mixed with guilt. Had he missed signs that Ajax was suffering? Should he have kept closer watch? Was this his fault? "Dad," Wyatt said as they paused to water the horses, "we need to consider that he might not have survived the night." The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Garrett's jaw clenched. "We keep looking." They pressed on into the afternoon, expanding their search to the far boundaries of the property. The sun was beginning its descent when Wyatt's radio crackled. It was Colleen back at the house. "Garrett, I've been thinking. When Ajax was young, where did your father keep him?" Garrett's brow furrowed. "The south pasture, by the old homestead. Why?" "Just a feeling." Animals remember, Garrett. They remember where they felt safe. The old homestead. Garrett hadn't been there in months. It was the original house his grandparents had built, now just a weathered shell with a collapsed roof and walls being slowly reclaimed by Montana wilderness. His father had kept the breeding bulls there in a small paddock, closer to the house for easier monitoring. Ajax had spent his first 5 years there before they'd moved the operation to the newer facilities. "It's 3 miles from the main barn," Wyatt said doubtfully. "Could Ajax really make it that far?" Garrett was already turning Stella's head toward the south. If he wanted to, he'd find a way. They rode hard, the horses' hooves thundering across the frozen ground. The sun was touching the mountain peaks when they crested the final hill, and the old homestead came into view below, a lonely cluster of weathered buildings against the vast Montana sky. And there, in the small paddock beside the ruins, stood Ajax. The massive bull was facing east, toward the sunrise, his head lowered as if in contemplation. His reddish coat caught the golden light, and despite his age, despite everything, he looked almost majestic standing there. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Tears he didn't know he'd been holding back blurred his vision. Ajax had come home. Not to the barn where he'd spent his retirement, but to the place where his life had begun. To the place where Garrett's father had first placed a gentle hand on his calf's head and whispered, "You're going to be something special, boy." Garrett dismounted before Stella had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard as he jogged toward the paddock. His heart hammered in his chest, relief, wonder, and a dozen other emotions he couldn't name all tangled together. "Ajax," he called softly, not wanting to startle the old bull. Ajax's massive head turned slowly, his dark eyes finding Garrett with the kind of recognition that went beyond simple animal instinct. There was something profound in that gaze, something that made Garrett feel like he was looking at an old friend who'd traveled a great distance to deliver an important message. The bull didn't move from his spot, just watched as Garrett approached the weathered fence. Up close, Garrett could see how much the journey had cost him. Ajax's legs trembled slightly with exhaustion, his breathing was labored, and there were scrapes along his flanks where he'd pushed through brush and brambles in the darkness. "You crazy old fool," Garrett whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What were you thinking coming all the way out here?" Wyatt came up behind him, leading both horses. "Dad, he's in rough shape. We need to get the trailer out here, get him back to the barn where we can tend to those cuts." But Garrett raised a hand, stopping his son mid-sentence. Just wait a minute." He climbed over the fence, the same fence his grandfather had built 76 years ago, now sagging and gray with age, and walked slowly toward Ajax. The bull watched him come, and when Garrett was close enough, Ajax lowered his great head and pressed his forehead gently against Garrett's chest. It was something they'd done 1,000 times before, this greeting, a gesture of trust and affection that Garrett's father had taught him to cultivate. "A bull that trusts you will work with you, not against you," his father used to say. "Treat him with respect, and he'll give you his whole heart." Ajax had given the Pritchard family 58 calves over his breeding years. Strong, healthy offspring that had built the ranch's reputation across 3 counties. He'd been gentle with children, including Wyatt when he was small. He'd never charged, never showed aggression, never caused a moment of trouble in 18 years. And now, here he stood, in the place where his story with the Pritchard family had begun. Garrett pressed his weathered palm against Ajax's broad forehead, feeling the warmth of the bull's skin, the slight tremor of exhaustion in his massive frame. "What brought you here, old friend? What were you looking for?" As if in answer, Ajax shifted his weight and turned his head toward the old homestead. Garrett followed his gaze and really looked at the place for the first time in years. The house was barely standing. The roof had caved in on the north side, and the porch where his grandmother used to shell peas had rotted away. But the bones were still there. The stone chimney his grandfather had built stone by stone. The doorframe where his father had carved the heights of Garrett and his siblings as they grew. The window where his mother had placed a lamp every evening to guide his father home from the fields. Beside the house stood what remained of the original barn, smaller than the current one, but built with the same careful attention. This was where his grandfather had kept his first cattle, where his father had learned to ranch, where Garrett himself had spent countless hours as a boy, learning the rhythms of ranch life, the patience required, the respect for the animals that sustained them. And this paddock, this small enclosed space, had been where they kept the breeding bulls during calving season, close to the house, close to watchful eyes. Ajax had been born in the newer facilities, but when he was 6 months old, Garrett's father had moved him here. "This one's special," his father had said. "He's got his great-grandfather's build. I want him close where I can keep an eye on his development." Garrett had been just 12 years old that summer. His father had assigned him the task of caring for Ajax, feeding him, grooming him, checking his hooves, spending time with him so he'd be accustomed to human handling. The memory came flooding back now with startling clarity. A boy and a young bull, both growing stronger together through that long Montana summer. Garrett teaching Ajax to lead with a rope halter, his father standing at the fence calling out instructions. "Firm but gentle, son. Let him know you're in charge, but never let him forget your partners." They'd spent hours in this very paddock. Garrett reading his school books aloud while Ajax grazed nearby. Garrett practicing his roping on fence posts while Ajax watched with what seemed like amusement. Garrett confiding his fears about starting high school, about whether he'd ever be as good a rancher as his father, about whether anyone would ever see him as more than old Pritchard's boy. Ajax had been his confidant that summer, his silent companion who never judged, never mocked, never doubted. "I haven't thought about that summer in years," Garrett said aloud, his hand still resting on Ajax's head. "You remember it, don't you? You remember when we were both young?" Wyatt had climbed over the fence and now stood a respectful distance away. "What summer, Dad?" Garrett turned to his son, seeing him properly for perhaps the first time that day. Wyatt looked so much like Garrett's father, the same square jaw, the same steady eyes, the same capable hands that could gentle a horse or mend a fence with equal skill. "The summer of 1989, Garrett said. "Your grandfather gave me responsibility for Ajax when he was just a calf, taught me everything about raising a bull, about building trust, about the partnership between rancher and animal." He paused, looking around the dilapidated homestead. "It happened here. All of it. This is where I became a rancher, Wyatt. Not in a classroom or from a book, but right here, with your grandfather's guidance and this bull's patience." Understanding dawned on Wyatt's face. And Ajax remembered. "Animals remember more than we give them credit for," Garrett said. "Especially the important things, the places where they felt safe, the people who treated them with kindness, the moments that mattered." Ajax shifted his weight again, his legs trembling. Garrett could see the toll the night's journey had taken. The bull had walked 3 miles in the cold darkness, navigating by instinct and memory, driven by something humans could only guess at. "We need to get him home," Wyatt said gently. "Those cuts need tending, and he needs food and water." Garrett nodded, but he didn't move immediately. He stood there with his hand on Ajax's head, looking at the ruins of the old homestead, and felt the weight of everything this place represented. 3 generations of Pritchards who'd worked this land, loved this land, built their lives from soil and sweat and stubbornness. His grandfather had started with 40 acres and 6 cattle. His father had expanded it to 800 acres. Garrett had brought it to 1,200. And now Wyatt was taking it into the future, implementing new techniques, sustainable practices, preparing for the challenges of modern ranching. But it had all started here, in this small, humble place. And somehow, Ajax had known that, had felt compelled to return to it. "All right, old friend," Garrett said softly. "Let's get you home. But Ajax?" He paused, making sure the bull was looking at him. "Thank you for reminding me what matters, for bringing me back here. I needed to remember too." Getting Ajax back to the main ranch proved more challenging than either Garrett or Wyatt anticipated. They'd called ahead, and Colleen had the trailer ready, but when they tried to load the exhausted bull, he planted his hooves and refused to move. "Easy, boy," Garrett coaxed, holding out a bucket of grain. "Come on now. You need rest and care." But Ajax just stood there in the paddock, his eyes fixed on the old homestead, as if memorizing every detail. It was Wyatt who finally understood. "Dad, I don't think he's ready to leave yet." Garrett looked at his son, then back at Ajax. The bull's breathing had steadied, and despite his exhaustion, there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there in months. Ajax had spent the last 5 years in comfortable retirement, fed and sheltered, but something had been missing. Purpose, maybe, or connection to something deeper than routine. "All right," Garrett said, making a decision. "We stay here tonight, all of us." Wyatt's eyebrows rose. "Out here? Dad, it's going to drop below freezing again." "Your grandfather and I camped out here plenty of times during calving season. We'll manage one night." Garrett pulled out his phone. "Call your mother. Tell her to bring blankets, medical supplies for Ajax's cuts, and some hot food. We're having a camp out at the old homestead." 2 hours later, Colleen arrived in the ranch truck, the bed loaded with supplies. She took one look at Ajax standing peacefully in the paddock and understood without explanation. "He needed to come home," she said simply, handing Garrett a thermos of coffee. They set up camp in what remained of the old barn. Wyatt built a fire in a safe spot, while Garrett carefully cleaned Ajax's scrapes with antiseptic, murmuring gentle words the entire time. The bull stood patiently, as if he knew they were helping him. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, the three of them sat around the fire with Ajax lying contentedly nearby in the paddock. The bull had finally eaten, drunk deeply from the water they'd brought, and settled down with what looked remarkably like satisfaction. "Tell me about Grandpa," Wyatt said suddenly, wrapping his hands around a mug of coffee. "Tell me about when he ran this place." Garrett smiled, staring into the flames. "Your grandfather was tough as nails but had the gentlest hands with animals I've ever seen. He could calm a spooked horse with just his voice. He taught me that strength isn't about dominance. It's about knowing when to be firm and when to be soft." "He sounds like you," Wyatt said quietly. The compliment made Garrett's throat tight. "He was better than me, more patient, wiser." He paused, glancing at Ajax. "That summer he gave me responsibility for Ajax. I thought it was just about learning animal husbandry, but it was about so much more. It was about trust, commitment, seeing something through even when it's hard. Ajax taught me as much as my father did." Colleen leaned against Garrett's shoulder. "And now Ajax has taught us something else. That the places we come from matter. That roots go deeper than we realize. That memory and love can pull us back to where we began, even when the journey is hard." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle and listening to Ajax's steady breathing. Above them, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a river of light. The same sky Garrett's grandfather had watched, the same stars that had guided generations of Pritchards through Montana nights. "I want to restore this place," Garrett said suddenly. The words surprised even him, but once spoken, they felt absolutely right. "Not to live in, but to preserve. This is where our family's story with this land truly began. It deserves better than to crumble into dust." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I'd like to help with that. Maybe we could use it for something, a place for ranch hands during calving season, or a retreat when we need to remember why we do this work." "A place to come home to," Colleen added softly. "When we forget what matters most." Ajax shifted in his sleep, and Garrett stood walking over to the fence. He rested his arms on the weathered wood his grandfather's hands had shaped, and looked out at the dark silhouettes of the mountains against the star-filled sky. This land had held his family for 3 generations. It had tested them, sustained them, shaped them into who they were. And an 18-year-old bull, driven by instinct and memory, had reminded him that some connections transcend logic. Some bonds, once formed, never truly break. "Thank you, Ajax," Garrett whispered into the night, "for bringing me back, for showing me what I'd forgotten." Tomorrow they would return to the main ranch, back to the rhythms of modern ranching. But tonight, they were exactly where they needed to be, where it all began. Spring arrived in Montana with its usual dramatic flair, snowmelt rushing down from the mountains, wildflowers erupting across the meadows, and the land shaking off winter's grip with an almost audible sigh of relief. Garrett stood in front of the old homestead, blueprint rolled under his arm, watching as the construction crew took measurements and made notes. 6 months had passed since that October night when Ajax had led them back here, and Garrett had spent every one of those months planning this restoration. It hadn't been easy convincing himself it was the right decision. The ranch finances were tight, as they always were. There were newer buildings that needed repair, equipment that needed replacing, a dozen practical reasons to let the old homestead continue its slow collapse into history. But every time doubt crept in, Garrett would think of Ajax standing in that paddock at dawn, and he'd know this was right. Some things mattered more than practical. Wyatt pulled up in his truck, stepping out with 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town. "Morning, Dad. Crew's making good progress." "Your mother would say I've lost my mind," Garrett said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Spending money we don't really have on a building we don't really need. Mom was the one who suggested we turn it into a heritage center," Wyatt reminded him. "A place to teach the next generation about traditional ranching methods. She's as invested in this as you are." It was true. Colleen had embraced the project with enthusiasm, already planning displays of old ranching equipment, photographs spanning 3 generations, and even a small library of ranching history books. She'd reached out to the local historical society, which had offered grant money to help preserve what they called an authentic example of early Montana homesteading. The restoration plan was ambitious but respectful. They'd stabilize the structure, replace the collapsed roof, restore the stone chimney, and repair the porch. But they'd keep the weathered wood, the worn floorboards, the marks of time that told the building's story. This wasn't about making it new. It was about honoring what it had been. "How's Ajax doing?" Wyatt asked. Garrett smiled. "Better than he's been in years. It's the strangest thing. Ever since that night, it's like he's got a new spark. He's more alert, more engaged. Doc Reynolds says sometimes animals just need a sense of purpose, and maybe walking back here gave him that." Ajax had indeed transformed. The journey that should have broken him had somehow renewed him. He'd recovered from his scrapes within weeks, and his overall health had stabilized. He still moved slowly, his hips still ached, but there was a contentment in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Garrett had moved Ajax to a pasture closer to the old homestead, within sight of the restoration work. The bull spent his days watching the progress, and Garrett swore Ajax understood what was happening. Animals knew more than humans gave them credit for. A truck pulled up, and Garrett recognized his neighbor, Frank Morrison, climbing out with his 12-year-old grandson, Tyler. Frank was in his 70s, one of the last of the old-time ranchers who'd known Garrett's father. "Heard you were bringing the old place back," Frank said, shaking Garrett's hand. "Had to come see it for myself." "It's been a long time coming," Garrett admitted. Frank walked slowly around the property, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. Tyler trailed behind, looking bored the way only a 12-year-old forced into adult activities could look. "Your daddy would be proud," Frank said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "We had some times in this place, him and me. Late nights during calving season, sitting on that porch solving the world's problems." He laughed. "Mostly we just drank coffee and complained about cattle prices, but it felt important at the time." "It was important," Garrett said. "That's what I'm trying to preserve. Not just the building, but what it represented. Community, tradition, the knowledge that gets passed down person to person, not from a book or a screen." Tyler had wandered over to Ajax's pasture and was staring at the massive bull with wide eyes. "Grandpa, is that the bull you told me about? The one that walked 3 miles in the dark?" Frank joined his grandson at the fence. "That's him, Ajax. 18 years old and still got stories to tell, don't you, old boy?" Ajax lifted his head, regarding them with patient dignity. "Why'd he come back here?" Tyler asked. It was Wyatt who answered. "Because this is where his story started, where he learned what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Sometimes we all need to remember where we came from." Tyler was quiet for a moment, actually paying attention now. "My dad wants me to move to Billings with him. Says there's no future in ranching, that I should focus on computers and tech stuff." Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Garrett recognized the pain of watching the next generation consider leaving the land. "Your dad's not wrong about the challenges," Garrett said carefully. "Ranching is hard. It's financially unpredictable, physically demanding, and sometimes heartbreaking. But Tyler, look around you." He gestured at the mountains, the rolling grassland, the big sky that seemed to go on forever. "This isn't just a job. It's a way of life. It's connection to the land, to animals, to something that matters beyond quarterly profits." But how do you know if it's worth it? Tyler asked. And the question was so earnest, so genuinely searching, that Garrett's heart ached for this kid caught between two worlds. Garrett looked at Ajax, at the old homestead being carefully restored, at his son standing beside him ready to carry the ranch into the future. You know it's worth it when you can't imagine doing anything else. When the thought of this land falling into other hands makes your chest hurt. When you'd rather struggle doing this than succeed doing something that doesn't feed your soul. He paused, then added, "But it has to be your choice, Tyler. Not your grandfather's, not your father's, yours. And whatever you choose, make sure it's because it's what you truly want, not what you think you should want." Tyler nodded slowly, his young face thoughtful. He turned back to Ajax. "He's beautiful, even though he's old." "Especially because he's old," Frank corrected gently. "Age isn't about losing value, son. It's about gaining wisdom, about knowing what matters. Ajax here, he knows exactly who he is and where he belongs. That's worth more than all the youth and strength in the world." As the Morrison truck pulled away an hour later, Wyatt turned to his father. "Think the kid will stay?" "I don't know," Garrett admitted. "But at least he's thinking about it. Really thinking. That's all we can ask." The restoration continued through spring and into summer. October returned, 1 year after Ajax's midnight journey. The restored homestead stood proud against the autumn sky, its fresh timber blending respectfully with weathered wood, the stone chimney rebuilt exactly as it had been. Garrett had organized a small ceremony, family, neighbors, old ranchers who remembered his father. 50 people gathered in the cool afternoon, their breath forming clouds as they stood before the building that represented 3 generations of Pritchard history. Ajax stood in his nearby pasture, watching with quiet dignity. At 19 now, he'd outlived expectations, his renewed purpose seeming to fuel his longevity. "This place almost became a memory," Garrett told the assembled crowd. "But an old bull reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, that our roots matter, that where we begin shapes everything that follows." He gestured to the homestead. "This will be a teaching place now, where kids like I once was can learn what it means to partner with animals, to respect the land, to understand that ranching isn't just business, it's stewardship." Young Tyler Morrison stood in the front row, having chosen to stay in Montana to learn ranching from his grandfather. His eyes shone with determination. As the sun set, painting the mountains gold, Garrett walked to Ajax's fence one final time. The old bull approached slowly, pressing his massive head against Garrett's chest in their familiar greeting. "Thank you, old friend," Garrett whispered, "for bringing me home, for showing me what I'd almost lost." Ajax's dark eyes held understanding, peace, completion. Some journeys end where they began, and sometimes that's exactly where they needed to go. The land would endure. The traditions would continue. And in a small Montana homestead, the story would live on, of a bull who remembered and a man who learned to remember with him. This farmer thought his old bull was gone until he found him standing where it all began.